Quote, horror fiction without violence doesn't do a great deal for me. I think that death and wounding need to be in the air. You've got to get the reader on this ghost train ride, and there's got to be something vile at the end of it. Or else, why aren't you on the roller coaster instead? And I like to be able to deliver the violence. There's never going to be any evasion. Whether it be sexual subject matter, whether it be violence, I'm going to show it as best I can. End quote. The year was 1983. Clive Barker and his partner John found a modest apartment on 29 Mount View Road in the Crouch End section of North London, with a reputation for making great things happen within the realm of horror fiction. It was the very same place where legendary horror writer Peter Straub wrote his breakthrough novel, Ghost Story, in 1979. Even more precise, it was the same apartment where, after a visit to Peter Straub, Stephen King wrote the short story Crouch End, published in 1980. Now, regarding the macabre, it was also the place where serial killer Dennis Nielsen murdered male prostitutes and drifters, burying their corpses in his drain. So this seemed like the perfect place for Clive to push the limits of horror fiction, the perfect place to write books of blood. So, a short rewind to 1981, when feeling overwhelmed by the long and intense hours working as a playwright, he felt the need for an outlet. Now, seeking this outlet, he began writing stories at every opportunity possible. It was an exercise in creativity, something he did to show his friends or simply for his own pleasure. Now, since he had no intention of showing these stories to anyone other than the occasional friend, he allowed himself total liberty when it came to themes and methods of execution. He had no particular plans for these creations. Well, while in a bookstore one day, he just so happened to stumble upon a hefty new anthology of original horror fiction titled Dark Forces. Isaac Bashevis Singer, Stephen King, Ramsey Campbell, Ray Bradbury, Joyce Carol Oates, among others, adorned the front cover. Taken aback, all these writers, various voices, all in the same book. The possibilities seemed endless. He understood that if this book could be published, there just might be a market for his short stories. He later referred to himself as arrogant when he contemplated the idea that he could possibly write an anthology just like Dark Forces. One catch, it was himself playing the part of all the various writers and voices on his own. He'd include some humor, some sexy material, some visceral ideas, some weirdness, and so on. Now, since no one told him not to do so, and given that no one told him short stories didn't really sell, he began writing more horror stories armed with a sense of fresh inspiration and devotion. Now, the stories were all written in a relatively short span, approximately 2 years. Now, what made it easier was how he'd had the stories rummaging in his mind for a while before deciding to put them on paper. And one of these stories was In the Hills and the Cities, a story about two towns that turn into giants. He quite often wrote stories in high states of excitement. He cried a significant amount when writing his stories, yet he also laughed a great deal. As a part of his process, he also read everything aloud as he wrote, acting out each part, which meant he seldom wrote with anyone else in the house on account of hating to be overheard in performance. And later he admitted that, at times, he would find himself disturbed by his own writing. Disturbed, yes, but never frightened. Now, after completing 5 stories, he passed them along to his theatrical agent, Vern Conway. Conway, in turn, offered the manuscript to Livia Galanche at Victor Galanche, a major hardcover publisher. Now, Galanche was deeply disturbed by the first 5 stories and informed Barker's camp that they wanted nothing to do with any of the stories. Conway then submitted the stories to Sphere Books, an independent paperback publisher. Now, Spear set a lunch and told them how much they liked the 5 stories and that they would be willing to publish anything else they had. Well, Barker and Conway informed Spear that those 5 stories were all they had. Now, Spear urged Barker to come back with more, so he began writing. He returned with 18 stories spread over more than 500 pages by 1983, and by that time he found his title, Books of Blood. And the editors at Sphere expressed their genuine interest. One condition, however, for the right price. Reason being that, though horror fiction had become successful, much of that success was by way of help from novels by Stephen King, James Herbert, and Peter Straub. You see, British and American publishers considered horror fiction a profitable marketing category. Unfortunately, however, that market seemed to be dwindling again by 1983, and for this reason, Sphere considered Barker's stories with cautious optimism. Nevertheless, impressed by his original literary voice, they took the gamble with hopes of stirring interest. At first, the stories were divided into three more easily digestible books, seeing as one large 500-page book wouldn't only be too much of a challenge for the average horror readers, but also the cover price could be seen as a deterrent. As a final touch, his name was added to the title. Now, in a rather gutsy move, Sphere simultaneously published Clive Barker's Books of Blood in 3 volumes in March of 1984, foregoing any advertising, promotion, or expectations. And the power of these books of blood lay in the boldness of their images. Never before had horror, or any fiction for that matter, been so openly explicit about sex and violence, or so clearly intertwined the two. Take, for example, Rawhead Rex, a story involving a baby-eating monster with a sick sexual appetite. Then there's Son of Celluloid, taking matters to a level never before seen in mainstream fiction by telling the tale of a cinema cancer that spawns bloodthirsty replicas of classic film actors. Now, the stories did indeed terrify and disturb. However, Barker never wrote the stories with this intention in mind. Rather, the intention was to excite. His mentality viewed them as adrenaline stories, exercises in how far and how bad things could get, yet still get the reader to want to keep turning those pages. It wasn't just about being gross and extreme, it was about striking a balance so that the reader didn't get lost along the way. In the autumn of 1985, all the hard work, all the chances taken were beginning to be recognized as Clive Barker was presented with the British Fantasy Award and the World Fantasy Award, each honoring Clive Barker's Books of Blood as the best collection of 1984. Almost simultaneously, Sphere issued a set of 3 new Books of Blood in paperback. Then there was the third, the fourth, the fifth, and sixth volumes, written for the most part while he drafted The Damnation Game. These volumes presented stronger narrative structures and a decided maturation of style. He was relying more often on craft than sheer explicitness of imagery to convey the horrors. He himself prefers the second series to the original, finding it richer, more confident, more steeped in paradox and metaphysics, and, on an intimate level, far more vicious. Still, that first Books of Blood, well, that's where it all began, cementing his name as a writer to be reckoned with. Horror fiction would never be the same again.